Okay, well, welcome everyone. So glad you're here. Sorry. What a way to start. I'm Annette Oltmans, founder and CEO of the MEND Project. Thank you for joining us for this month's training intensive, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and what's the scoop? Before we get into today's topic, on the third Tuesday of each month, we host a free training intensive where we take a deeper look at a single subject for about an hour. And to view the recording of today's training or past intensives, please visit the MEND Project's YouTube channel or take a look at the videos hosted on our Facebook page. Please share any recordings you enjoy with your friends and your colleagues. It's one of the key ways that you can help men to have a greater impact by educating more people on various forms of abuse. The best way to stay informed on upcoming intensives or other educational opportunities is by signing up to receive email notifications on our website. And also, if there are topics that you'd like to see us cover, please feel free to share them with us through our website or at info@themendproject.com. We love to hear your ideas. And if we have a lot of content on that, we will do it intensive. And oftentimes we research the content to create an intensive. So we really love to have your input. I want to share some upcoming training opportunities with you. Beginning on August 15th, we will be hosting 3 new cohorts, one for victims or survivors of abuse and anyone who is in a high conflict relationship but is unsure whether it's abuse. And then we have another one for those who are responding to those in abusive relationships. And finally, I'm so excited to announce that for the first time, we're offering continuing education units through the American Psychological Association in a special course for counselors, therapists, and graduate students. These 7-week interactive online courses teach you all about emotional abuse, trauma, double abuse, and other related topics that will help participants gain further understanding and insight, really gain clarity, as well as trauma-informed healing ways to respond and to help oneself. And if you sign up on our website to receive information on future trainings, you'll be one of the first to know when registration opens. For those of you in a position to give financially, I ask you to consider investing in MEND. Far too many survivors of abuse have been victims of financial abuse and are in precarious financial situations that don't allow them to register for these types of training programs at full price. Even many of our responder groups who serve marginalized communities do not have the capacity in their budgets to pay for training. And it requires a lot of work to put on trainings with our staff. And so please consider giving financially to help support them and the MEND Project. We're a nonprofit organization that relies on the generosity of others to continue our work. Okay, so today we're going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and what's the scoop? What do they mean? At the end of my talk, we will have an open question and answer time. So please don't wait till then. When you have a question, put it in the chat and Jill will make sure we address it at the end. Also know that this is being recorded. So if you have to leave before your question is answered, you can also review the recording. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a condition that is mostly triggered by a terrifying event. It can include unwanted, intense, and even disturbing thoughts and feelings related to that experience that lasts months and sometimes years after the traumatic event has ended. PTSD may look like flashbacks or hypervigilance. That's that anticipatory fear that more trauma is to come, just general fear about a number of things, and anger is another emotion that crops up a lot with PTSD victims. There's the freezing where they isolate and don't communicate or express almost flatline emotions like a numbing, resulting in unwarranted conflicts. And if there's a lot of anger, it can create unwarranted conflicts. Or if the victim is stuck in fear, it's creates isolation, and victims can't heal in isolation. So I just want to make that point before we move forward. Post-traumatic stress happens post-trauma. They are connected. And today I'm going to start by covering a few types of trauma. I will talk about the differences between single event trauma, chronic trauma, and complex trauma. I will also address the importance of identifying trauma symptoms and responding to someone who is experiencing post-traumatic stress or complex post-traumatic stress. If you have experienced or if you are currently experiencing trauma and its lasting effects, I'm going to go over the importance of self-care towards the end. Okay, so single event trauma has a clear beginning, middle, and an end. Once the traumatic event has ended, the survivor of the event can find safety, get help, and recover. Chronic trauma, or prolonged and repeated trauma, reoccurring trauma, provides no relief for the person experiencing it. It is repetitive, which means the traumatized individual does not have adequate time to recover and heal before they are re-traumatized again in a new, like for example, in abusive situations, they're re-traumatized before they can heal from the last trauma. Complex trauma happens when an individual experiences multiple interpersonal or invasive traumas, and where the victim is overcome with a sense of hopelessness and despair. There's a loss of identity, and I'll go into that a little bit more. In cases of relational abuse, most often victims are experiencing chronic recurring trauma or complex trauma over a long period of time. They might suffer from prolonged stress and confusion due to the fact that they have not been able to understand the dynamics that they are experiencing are actually abusive and are causing them post-traumatic stress. Most victims don't realize that they have post-traumatic stress, and the more traumatic their experience and the more their symptoms overtake them, the more their mind becomes dysregulated, and it becomes really difficult for them to identify what's happening to them. And this and the subsequent physiological symptoms caused by post-traumatic stress are significantly damaging to a victim's mental, emotional, and yes, physical health. And often the victim doesn't understand why. It's important for us to understand trauma better and to be able to identify some of the common symptoms of trauma. For those who are in or have been in abusive relationships, this understanding will help to explain some of the physical, neurological, and psychological symptoms they've been experiencing. Far too often, victims attempt to get medical help without realizing their symptoms are related to abuse-inducing stress. And understanding that connection can help physicians or psychologists to diagnose and treat the medical symptoms without spending significant time and resources guessing what medical conditions are being presented or why they're being presented. Like, what is the source of that? They're very real medical conditions, but they're often induced by stress and high production of cortisol and adrenaline, which in turn exhausts the endocrine system and makes it difficult to defend illnesses. Many victims will testify to having been to many doctor visits without any diagnosis being attributed to ongoing stress or an appropriate treatment given. When we are more aware of our own trauma symptoms, it helps us to self-identify and explore what triggering events has caused them. And by knowing and being aware of your own trauma symptoms, you're able to better advocate for yourself with physicians and psychologists. Being able to connect the trauma symptoms to the circumstances of our relationship helps us to in turn advocate for the right help and treatment that we need, as well as encourage us to take steps to prevent additional events from exacerbating our current condition. Now, just one second, I wanted to look at my notes because something cropped up in my mind. Okay, I know we're getting into this, so I just wanted to check. Often trauma manifests through physical illnesses such as fluctuating blood pressure. So the blood pressure might go really high or it might be really low. That's what I experienced, and it caused me to lose consciousness several times in random places. Or my blood sugar level would drop really low because my endocrine system wasn't working properly. Another common experience is autoimmune diseases that require medical intervention, but also make them appear physically and the victim will appear physically and emotionally weak and may dilute the appearance of strength and validity in their words. So they don't come across confidently advocating. They're weak and meek and tentative, which makes it difficult for the therapist or the physician to really identify what's happening. Responders may wonder if what the victim is sharing is really just the physical illness speaking, and then not identifying the relationship trauma. And victims often become too exhausted to even communicate what's happening or to bring it up again because it's re-traumatizing. And you'll see this by they often don't take good care of themselves. They're so exhausted. Responders may notice poor hygiene or other neglectful conditions. That it doesn't have to be extreme poor hygiene, but it can just be a difference in the person. If they're their ongoing physician, they'll see a change, and that's a dead giveaway. Or oftentimes victims will overwork to look perfect when in public, but fall apart when they get home, choosing to isolate themselves. And this is important for you to know about yourself. Knowing that all of these symptoms are an outflow or a response to the originating trauma of emotional or other forms of abuse is key for a first responder to be able to identify the red flags of existing abuse. And once responders are able to identify red flags, they can judge more accurately what's happening and be a vessel for healing. For those of us who play a role as a responder to a victim of abuse, it's important to know that many people fail to identify or they misunderstand trauma symptoms that are presenting in the victim. So responders often don't understand what they're seeing, which can cause them to unknowingly or unintentionally respond to a victim in a way that actually compounds their trauma because they're misreading their trauma symptoms. So for example, if a trauma victim is triggered and they express anger, it may put off the responder and think they're emotionally unstable, not recognizing that these fight, flight, freeze, and appease involuntary responses are signs of trauma. Responders also often minimize chronic repeated trauma if there isn't a single traumatic event they can put their finger on. Minimizing trauma is an example of what I call double abuse, which refers to the harmful responses survivors often receive when they reach out for help. Double abuse is the inadvertent or, at times, intentional secondary layer of harm that takes place when a victim is not believed, or at times they're blamed, they're minimized, they're ignored, where the person that the victim is confiding in just chooses to dismiss what they're saying, or they give unwanted or incorrect instructions. You should do this, you should do that, when the victim knows best. And oftentimes they're criticized, they're interrogated, victims are judged, and even shunned by sometimes their faith community, or maybe it's their work environment, or their family or social community, instead of being listened to, believed, and supported when they speak out or seek help. Often double abuse happens when well-meaning people who are uneducated about abuse and trauma respond poorly. Unfortunately, the responder's desire to help does not decrease the harm that the victim experiences when they doubly abuse them through their responses. It exacerbates the harm. And oftentimes victims will say that it's that secondary layer, that double abuse, that was more traumatic to them than the original abuse. And I may have this in my notes, but I don't want to forget to say it. When a victim confides in someone that they trust, or if that person is in a position of perceived knowledge or perceived authority, the victim places a lot of hope in that person. They usually don't speak out until abuse has been going on for an extended period of time and they're weary and exhausted, and they really are seeking for someone to help intervene. And when they're not responded to with support and compassion, it leads the victim to feeling overcome with a sense of hopelessness and despair, which leads to complex post-traumatic stress. And the victim loses a sense of identity. And this is really critical when talking about complex post-traumatic stress, because when you are looking for other people to validate you and support you, and to support your place in your social community or in your church community or in your corporation, when people don't support you, you lose your identity, you lose your standing, you feel a loss. And when you have that kind of a loss, it really is the triggering point that brings on complex post-traumatic stress. And this can happen without double abuse in a complex abusive relationship, particularly if there's any sexual marital rape or other areas where the victim doesn't have control over any aspect of sexuality. When it is in such an intimate, sacred space in the relationship, the victim can lose a sense of personhood and identity and have feelings of hopelessness and despair, which leads to complex post-traumatic stress. When double abuse takes place by trusted individuals who carry influence in the victim's life, so if it's a family member who is influential or social people are influential, it has the same effect if they harm them. It results from a series of very traumatic events, which the individual feels little or no chance to escape. They are overwhelmed with feeling entrapped. And that's why victims who are kidnapped and are entrapped, they often end up with complex post-traumatic stress. But you don't have to literally be kidnapped and entrapped to feel that same kind of entrapment, that there's not a way out. If you can't have people help you, and you're not supported, then that feeling can often occur, because victims cannot heal in isolation. They need connection and they need support on their journey. And victims have also already been spoken down to so much by their abuser that they already have a high level of self-doubt, feelings of something must be inherently wrong with me. I must not be lovable. These all play into a weakened sense of identity, which then makes them very vulnerable to developing complex post-traumatic stress. It's particularly harmful when prolonged and repetitive exposure to traumatic events is occurring. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder has a significant effect on a person's emotional regulation and their identity, like I said. It sets in motion a biochemical, immunological chain of events that may result in an unusual number of medical problems. Victims may be so overwhelmed with emotional dysregulation, things like fragmented thinking. And you'll notice fragmented thinking when they have a hard time completing a thought or staying focused in the conversation, or if somebody interrupts them, like if they're sharing their story and someone says, well, did you try this? That detour, that interruption in the conversation often causes the victim to lose their place in what they were talking about, and that's fragmented thinking. And it causes medical illnesses, that I said, that people have a hard time understanding what the source of the problem is. And the more fragmented their thinking becomes, the more difficult it is to discern what's happening to them because their cognition is compromised. One may vacillate from anger one day to true feelings of terror, the next to despair, to numbness, and then back again. It can be very uncomfortable to watch or sit with someone or walk alongside someone with post-traumatic stress. A healing response is what a victim really needs, and helping victims of abuse gain clarity about their circumstances and preventing double abuse by training responders are both aimed to reduce trauma. And responders also can speak into the value of the person and really model for them how they are worthy of being treated so much better, so that it helps counteract some of those internal feelings of self-doubt and self-loathing that interferes with their sense of identity. I hope that makes sense. The recurring trauma a victim experiences from ongoing relational abuse has a strong impact on their ability to leave the person who is harming them. And this is due often to trauma bonding. Understanding the effect of trauma bonding will help you understand why it can be emotionally very confusing and challenging to choose to leave the relationship. Understandably, victims are usually starved for love and validation, forcing them to turn to the very ones who are harming them. So, in an abusive relationship, oftentimes there are good times, but it's sabotaged by the intensity and the cruelty and the lack of empathy during the bad times. But the victim is starved for love and validation. And so it forces them to turn to the person who's actually harming them because they want that secure attachment, those feelings of an attachment. And those are the very people that they seek validation from. But because the repeated trauma has compromised their brain functions with cognition, problem-solving, dysregulated emotions, elevated nervous system responses, and ongoing amygdala and hippocampus heightened activity, victims struggle to find clarity and peace and self-protectiveness, which is what they should be doing, protecting themselves from someone who is being abusive. They are dogged by self-doubt and a lowered sense of self-worth, which really interferes with their ability to discern what's happening. And there's a lack of certainty within them. And so while looking to their abusers for support, that rarely comes, and even longing for freedom from the abuse, but still believing in some way that they deserve the maltreatment that they're receiving because of those feelings of unworthiness and like something is intrinsically wrong with them. They don't identify, and instead they trauma bond with the very person who's harming them. So why does a responder need to be informed, educated, and aware of trauma? There's three key reasons I can think of. And the first is to prevent causing further harm and compounding the trauma the abuse victim has experienced. And next is to identify the signs of trauma and to recognize the red flags or indicators that something more may be going on than what meets the eye. And then finally, to connect with the one being harmed so that you can be instrumental in their processing and healing. Victims need a safe place and the space in time to process out loud what the confusion that they're going through. They need to work it out loud with someone safe. And so it's important to be trained as a responder to know how to do this well. The response given when abuse is disclosed is powerful and will set the individual on course towards their healing or cause further harm. When a responder does not respond properly, the victim can remain in a place of shame, which includes self-doubt and feeling responsible for the abuse. This shame causes trauma in victims to become worn down and weary, even immobilized, not able to fight back or find a way through. Abuse has a way of creating non-resilience in the victim. Now, why is that? Because the chronic and complex trauma they are experiencing is deeply impacting their brain. The effects of trauma on the brain are profound and usually long-lasting. This is why we do the work that we do and go in depth, providing an entire session on trauma in our 7-week online curriculum. Trauma and the effects that other people can have on an abuse victim is the reason we do the work that we do, because it is so harmful. Complex PTSD can take several years to heal. Even with multiple modalities in service of the victim, where regular PTSD, if they have all the support that they need and different therapy modalities and other things I'll get into in a minute, they can heal much faster. So it's really serious to get complex post-traumatic stress. And it's really important for victims to understand and for therapists to understand that if somebody has regular PTSD, they are even more vulnerable to having that develop into complex PTSD. So it's really critical that one knows how to protect themselves from double abuse and only confide in really safe people and only confide in a therapist who feels safe and fully aligned with the victim. One note about trauma in the brain I want to make today relates to children. During the developmental stages of life, a child's brain is developing. Therefore, brain development is seriously disrupted by trauma. And at this time, there's a consortium of psychologists, psychiatrists, and medical professionals who are promoting a new diagnosis to more accurately represent the developmentally aged child, because complex stress they may deal with is well known to cause lifelong emotional and physiological health problems. This new diagnosis that's proposed to be in the DSM-5, the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual for Therapists and Medical Professionals, this new diagnosis is called developmental trauma disorder. And even though it's not in the DSM-5 now, you can Google it and read some really good information about this disorder. And it's the result of multiple exposure to interpersonal trauma, such as witnessing domestic violence, experiencing abandonment, having a disorganized attachment from their primary caregivers, feelings of betrayal, or experiencing physical or sexual assaults. So I hope you'll take a look at that. An informed, educated, and aware responder can be a healing balm for trauma survivors and encourage their journey towards healing, wholeness, freedom, and hope. Compassionate connection can help the victim get on a path of healing. And that's why it's so important that when a victim confides in you, that you don't ignore them, that you don't say, I don't want to get involved, I want to play neutral, I don't know who to believe. It's really important to believe victims and to not abandon them, because feelings of abandonment really exacerbates trauma. You can imagine that it would cause anxiety in a person without PTSD, but anxiety in somebody with post-traumatic stress or complex post-traumatic stress really just means more trauma because it's so heightened. So we just want to be mindful to maintain connection, a supportive, compassionate connection to victims that are confiding in you. There is a term called post-traumatic growth that comes after trauma, when one has actually overcome their trauma. Post-traumatic growth, sorry, that's a tongue twister, can happen with therapy. It can happen naturally, but it's a process of hard work and struggle that creates resilience following trauma. And I mentioned before that it takes multiple modalities to help heal from trauma. I want to go into some of that in just a few minutes, but post-traumatic growth can be achieved in multiple ways. For example, through therapy, through educating oneself, through disclosure and narrative development regarding their story, participating in various activities that begin to create, and this is really important, a sense of accomplishment and autonomy. So when a victim can actually have autonomy and succeed in that, it could be a yoga class that he or she gets good at, or knitting a sweater. It doesn't matter, whatever they place their passion in, that is all their own, that they don't have to share with the abuser, that they do on their own, and then they achieve success. It can have a strong level of self-improvement towards post-traumatic growth. Responders walking closely with victims, such as trauma-trained therapists. Sorry, you guys. Excuse me. Will recognize changes. So trauma-trained therapists will recognize changes, such as the victim's ability to suddenly be able to, or gradually, I should say, be able to emotionally regulate themselves. They'll be able to talk about the trauma more freely without involuntarily shaking and having some of the obvious signs of PTSD, which is a strong sign of growth. It shows that they have begun to overcome the space where they are involuntarily reacting, and they're able to control their reactions. They're able to tap into controlled responses. They've replaced the involuntary responses with better responses that they've thought about and put into deliberate action. They've then developed a stronger sense of self and self-worth, where they now, excuse me, my dog's crying. I have to open the door and let her out. Sorry about that. So sorry, she was only going to get louder. Okay. So they're able to tap into controlled responses. Like I said, they have developed a stronger sense of self, where they now understand that the abuse was not their fault. So it's critical in therapy, especially early therapy, that the therapist always takes some time, and that the victim understands that they need to work on changing their own belief system about themselves. Those negative thoughts about themselves are so deeply ingrained, they may not even be aware of them. But if you are a victim or a survivor, please think about those thoughts of self-doubt, of feeling unlovable, like you must have caused the problems in the relationship. Those are a faulty belief system that you really need to work on by creating affirmations for yourself and reading them, and really getting in touch with the things that you know are worthy about you and lovable about yourself. And, you know, you need to love yourself more than anyone else, because you spend more time with yourself than anyone else does. And your self-love will protect you against maltreatment, because you'll recognize that you don't deserve it. And it will help you parent better, because you will encourage that in your children as well, that sense of empowerment and self-love. Okay, so post-traumatic growth results in a higher level of functioning in 5 areas. First, it promotes spiritual development, resulting in a deepening faith or even making significant changes in one's belief system. Like I just talked about, that faulty belief about yourself, it will be replaced with strong beliefs of love for yourself. And next, it creates a greater personal strength, where the survivor experiences increased awareness of their own inner strength and a strong sense of I can and I deserve better. They will truly believe this about themselves. And it may take a long time to get to that place, but it takes deliberate work and energy, effort, activity to create this sense of I can and I deserve better. And I'll go into some of those things. And third, it encourages close relationships where true, safe, empathic intimacy is a reality, and they get to enjoy and cherish close connection with others who are safe. So emotional intimacy is where there's a higher level of emotional IQ than what the abuser has, who shuts down the victim's emotions, who stonewalls healthy conversations. A healthy person, and it doesn't have to be an intimate lover, it can be family members or new friends, that maybe the victim needs to find new healthy friends that can be in connection with them, modeling those more positive behaviors. And when they develop those close relationships, it's a sign of post-traumatic growth. And fourth, it results in a greater appreciation for life in general. They don't give up their life so well. I remember in my abusive relationship, I gave up so much of myself. I didn't even know who I was anymore. And coming through that, I now have a strong sense of autonomy and a greater appreciation for life, that I'm not going to give my life over to somebody else to abuse. Life has precious moments, and I'm going to seize every one of them. And finally, number 5, it reignites dreams and new possibilities, where they are thriving and aware of new opportunities and priorities. So they're able to look towards the future with a sense of hopelessness and even a sense of adventure and excitement. These are the signs that a victim survivor has experienced post-traumatic growth. It's an important part of a role of a responder to encourage victims to know that this growth can happen for them too. Okay, now I want to talk about how victims can help themselves achieve that. But I also, before I do that, I want to say that sometimes responders may experience vicarious trauma, or what some term as compassion fatigue, from walking alongside a victim survivor. This is not uniformly true. So in other words, it doesn't always happen, but it's also not uncommon. This is when the responder feels the effects of the victim's trauma. They take it on so personally and are not able to detach from it. And so it's important for responders to take care of themselves too. Self-care is a form of self-love, and self-love is how we lead the journey of recovery. Loving ourselves and caring well for ourselves is key to being a healthy, healing responder and a healthy person in general. If you are a victim or survivor, self-love and self-care may seem foreign as you've placed others' needs and loving others above yourself. But like I said before, it's a really essential part of the healing process. Some of the same activities we recommend for victims are the same that we recommend for responders. So as we close today, I want to go, and before I go into Q&A, I want to share a few ideas that you can use to promote healing, self-regulation, and to recenter when one is feeling the effects of trauma. So responders can do this, and victims and survivors can do this. So one thing you can do to relieve stress, anxiety, or fear, it might seem silly, but you can sing aloud or listen to uplifting music to really create a mood change in the room, and it'll increase your endorphins. Or if that feels too stimulating, because some are overstimulated, listen to the sound of a babbling brook, or the notes of a violin or a viola, or birds chirping in the early morning. And all of these sounds can be found on the internet, Spotify, YouTube, etc. You might want to take your shoes off and walk on smooth stones or the sand at the beach. Let the coolness of the ocean or lake or creek or river wash over your feet or hands. If you're not near the beach or other waterways, take a warm bath or a nice shower, and perhaps fill a bucket with some water and soak your feet. In other words, you can have a nice hot cup of tea and take a bath, or a glass of wine, and really pamper yourself in the moment, light some candles, and create an ambiance for yourself. And combine this experience with have a nice dinner for yourself, or like I said, lighting candles. Just make it so that you really have a good ambiance so you're treating yourself. And you might want to add essential oils and diffusers. They're not just a fad. They really can change your mood. Try some citrus-based oils like orange or lemon in a diffuser and notice how quickly your mood perks up as that fragrance fills the room. Or you can identify some smells that remind you of happy times, perhaps jasmine to remind you of your childhood garden, or cloves to remind you of smells during the holidays, or pine to remind you of hiking. These might seem kind of insignificant things to do, but honestly, when someone is going through trauma, they are so depleted that we want to use every method necessary to increase endorphins and to counteract those dark feelings and hopelessness feelings that are overcoming them. You might like to pull out one of those adult coloring books along with some colorful markers or pencils and pay attention to the various colors as you fill in the pictures on the pages. Using both sight and touch will bring you to a present and begin to calm you. It's like doodling, but it's beautiful. And so it's like creative art, any kind of art or DIY or just creative project is a really good way to bring healing to yourself. Or try brain games, crossword puzzles, or jigsaw puzzles. If you can't do that, simply sit outside on a park bench, chair at the beach, and look around you. Pay close attention to each item you see and naming it in your head aloud, like bird, tree, grass, boat. Just make sure that you're noticing them. Sight will connect to mind and bring you back to the present. Please don't make the excuse that you don't have the time or that you're so protective in isolation. You have to stretch yourself. To get over trauma, it is not easy because it's uncomfortable to stretch yourself and you are bogged down with fear and so much self-doubt. But you're your own best advocate. Nobody can do the work for you. And a therapist isn't enough. You need to take these steps. It's important to force yourself to take these steps or have somebody who's willing to be an accountability partner and say, I will meet you once a week and we will go on a walk. Or I'm going to call you once a day to say, what activity are you going to do for yourself today? If you have a safe friend who's willing to step into this role, it's a wonderful thing you can do for yourself. So self-care is critically important. Self-love is critically important. And that might include physical exercise, which I personally I used to work out all the time. And when I went through my trauma, I just isolated and froze and didn't even go for a walk unless a friend drugged me out there. I was just so still and isolated. And once I finally started making myself, which it took me about a year, once I finally made myself do yoga, walk, run, go for bike rides, sing, pray. Well, I always was praying, but I wasn't uplifting. I wasn't doing uplifting things and I wasn't physically active. That physical activity created powerful endorphins and I will never forget that feeling. So it's really important that you do that for yourself. Take the time, resist isolating or freezing, and know that you are worth every minute of effort you apply to your self-care. Okay, so in closing today, I'd like to invite you to join our mailing list where you will receive updates about our training courses, newsletters, and blogs. And please head over to our website and sign up today. Now, as we close, I'd like to take time for any questions you may have, so feel free to drop them in the chat box.
Hi, Annette. Okay.
Hi.
So we do have a number of questions here, and actually all of them are from our PhDs, our licensed clinical psychologists. And so I want to there's maybe a handful. So I'm just going to go one by one and we'll go through them and address them. The first question is, does the mental health field consider repetitive relationship betrayal as emotional abuse that can lead to c-ptsd?
In my experience, I think that emotional abuse is underrepresented. I don't see it in the DSM-5. I'm not an expert. I'm not a psychologist, but I have spent a lot of time researching, and I've interviewed hundreds of victims who have had really bad therapeutic encounters where the emotional abuse wasn't recognized. And I've had a lot of therapists who we've trained who have said, oh my gosh, we never learned this because so few hours are required in their primary academic, in their postgraduate work, that they don't really understand. They don't have clarity, so they're not equipped to diagnose when emotional abuse is taking present. But those who are in the trenches, really working with domestic violence, understand that victims who experience physical violence will say that the emotional abuse was so much worse. Unfortunately, I don't understand why there's such a cavern of space between what actually occurs and what professionals understand about it. But I'm sure it has to do with board protocols for their required learning courses. And it's just underrepresented is the best way I can answer that.
Yeah, really good. And this other question, you kind of answered it. This next question is regarding c-ptsd to be considered an actual diagnosis in the DSM at some point, and why does the ICD include it but not the DSM? And I know therapists who have shared with us that those are used for insurance purposes for diagnoses, and so there is that lack, and you kind of just spoke to that, so I don't know if you want to say more.
Well, I think eventually it will be, but so many therapists say they just hate the DSM because there's so many incorrect things in there, and there's so many things that are omitted. And it's a constant fight each time a new DSM is being, I guess it's an ongoing committee. And there's a lot of contention in this committee about what should be included and what shouldn't. And there's a lot of politics. So I really just try to educate people about c-ptsd and steer them towards the ICD-11. Thank goodness it's there, so it is legitimized globally, but we're, the United States, and we're behind the times. We're behind the times when it comes to domestic violence, and we're behind the times when it comes to diagnoses and treatments.
Yeah, very good. And then there was a third question, and actually Annette, Stephanie addressed it because it was related to law. And so the question, I'll let you know, is it possible for c-ptsd to hold up in the courts as abuse in a lawsuit? And Stephanie is our executive director and is also an attorney, and she's taken great interest in this question and has said it's something that she actually wants to look into further.
Well, I can tell you that when we did a talk at Pepperdine University to their law students and their law professors, they said that they were going to use that in their future legal cases. So I think the fact that it's in the ICD-11 will give some credence to that if they call in an expert witness who recognizes the diagnosis and appreciates the diagnosis. I think that it could be.
Very good.
Just according to what was communicated to me at Pepperdine.
Yeah. And then the final question from this particular PhD is there any sort of c-ptsd certification available? This person has a psych PhD, but is interested in trauma certification.
Gosh, I really have never seen one. I try to scroll through a lot of courses at different I don't know what you call them, different companies that offer continuing education courses. I haven't seen one on c-ptsd, which I think is pretty typical for the fact that how would they get board approval to teach the course when it's talking about a diagnosis that's not in the DSM? So I haven't seen that, but this might seem silly, but I think that I don't normally recommend Wikipedia, but I know that Dr. Judith Herman wrote the Wikipedia page on CPTSD, and there's a lot of valuable information in there.
Yes, and I believe, I'm glad you said that, because Stephanie also said something to that effect in our chat. We have a number of questions, so Stephanie and I are kind of going back and forth.
Okay.
It's a very full group today, which is amazing and awesome, and we love it. So we thank you for all of these questions. And then there's one more question from a different PhD who's asking, as a clinician, how can a clinician navigate fragmented thinking with themselves or a client lose their train, or when the client loses their train of thought without disruption or disrupting their emotional reaction to the topic? And Annette, while you've said you're not licensed to really provide instruction for clinicians, I don't know if there's something you can speak to that to help someone who's in that position.
I know I do have to disqualify myself, but I will say that when I was going through that, and it was so disruptive when a therapist would say something like, well, why did you stay so long? Or something that made me feel like I had to defend myself. My defenses were so high when I had CPTSD. I think would be helpful to say, well, the last thing you just said was this or that or that. Was there something more that you wanted to say about that? And help them get back on track and really focus on affirming them. You're doing so well. Like, they're so starved for affirmations. They have so much self-doubt that speaking into them in that way and helping them remember what they were talking about and really staying with them in that, I think is really helpful. It helped me when I interviewed 11 therapists. I told them I was shopping for a therapist, and because I had so much misdirected therapy and so many times couple therapists did not recognize the abuse, which made it so much worse. And so I was just counseled by an expert therapist who was no longer practicing to actually shop. And I would ask them questions, and it became so clear that they didn't understand PTSD or emotional abuse. So I would just move on until I found someone that really understood and was able to sit with me where I was and also help take me through just this solid alignment and affirmation and helping me process my story, helping me stick with my story where I was when I so often was just overwhelmed and shaking like a leaf. They just really stayed with me and helped me process through everything I needed to process through. I don't know if that helps you, if that's too vague. I'm sorry I can't clinically give you a modality or I'm really stretching myself, but I know that at Marriage Recovery Center, they use that dialectical, does that make sense? Modality to help victims. And I don't know what that is. I need to read about that, but I know one really good abuse therapy center that helps both the perpetrator side and the victim side. And that's what that's the modality they favor.
Really good and helpful, Annette. Thank you. So here's another question we have. I want to get to everyone. And if we don't, for some reason today, address your question, if something is missed, please feel free to email us at info@themendproject.com, because every question is so important. And we have about 5 minutes remaining. So here's the next question, Annette. When supporting a survivor who has experienced prolonged PTSD and is showing post-trauma growth in their life, how do you handle the impulse they may have to just walk away if there is a minor conflict to work through in a friendship? It is so hard. They have strong emotions about many things, and it is painful seeing that impulse to just burn it all down and run, and they put in their words.
I think that it's kind of like a pendulum swing. So when a victim finally finds their voice and they're in that stage of post-traumatic growth, and so it's almost like they swing too far for a while and they're really strong and defensive and advocating for themselves and they're not going to take any crap. It's kind of like that until the pendulum starts to swing back and they're able to be more regulated in the middle, to be able to have the emotional IQ and the actual physiological awareness of what the other person is communicating and what, assimilating emotions. They're able to assimilate others' emotions in a more regulated way. I just don't think they've really gained the ability to regulate those conflicts. So they just say, I don't need it. I want out. And that might be for a time, and then they reconnect with that person later. But I think it's hard to force them into viewing it differently. You can nudge them and maybe offer a conversational solution that they might have with that person. But I've seen this over and over again, and I know that it was true for myself too. I just got to a place where I don't want any negative chatter. I don't want anybody who I don't feel safe with. It's too triggering. I don't need it. I need to be focusing on other things right now. I don't know if that helps you, but.
Yeah, really good, Annette. I'll just do 2 more questions, Annette, to wrap up our time. And, but there's one thing I do want to say. We do have a number of questions and comments coming in about how helpful and what a good refresher this workshop or this intensive has been. And
thank you.
Yeah, I want to share that with you because we have a lot of really great feedback from people who are practicing, whether they're a counselor or a PhD, and whatever level we have a number of people who are writing, different levels of credential that they have. And I want to encourage you to reach out to us because we do offer a more in-depth session. We also offer CEUs, et cetera. So we want you to reach out to us because
let me just talk a second about that. So in our curriculum, in the cohorts that we have coming up in August, it's a 7-week course. Actually for CEUs, it's shorter. It's 4 weeks. And it's an online curriculum that's very thorough. And then I do a 1 or 2 in the professional cohort. I do a 2-hour talk with Dr. David Hawkins of the Marriage Recovery Center, who is an expert on abuse and offers just a wealth of experience. And so it's really a worthwhile dynamic conversation where you can contribute to those conversations. You can ask your questions, and we really go into how to treat the abuser and how to identify the confusing, complicated natures of emotional abuse. Double abuse and the effects of trauma. All of that is really thoroughly unpacked beyond what's in the written curriculum. So the live sessions enhance what the written curriculum, and the written curriculum takes you only 30 minutes a week to read. So it's not a big burden, but it's aimed to be very concise and to simplify some of the more complicated topics surrounding abuse. So I encourage you to sign up.
Yes, please join us. Okay, I do want to ask this. There's 2 questions that are kind of related, and I think it's a beautiful way for us to close out today. And so one of them is about resources that they can use to train themselves in empathy. And similarly, the second question, we can kind of put them together, is about someone who is walking alongside someone with PTSD and hasn't responded because they don't want to respond in a negative way. So are there positive response examples? So how do we practice?
Yeah, okay. So on our website, if you go to themenproject.com and you look up our healing model of compassion, we have an accountability model of courage. which is how to interface with an abuser. And we have our healing model of compassion, which basically gives you simple steps for how to interface with a victim. You don't have to be an expert on abuse, but if you do those things, at least you know you won't be doing further harm. Now, obviously, if you're a practicing therapist and this is your client, you're going to need to be able to do things beyond our healing model, but you'll get the idea of what needs to be happening from the healing model of compassion. And in our 7-week curriculum, we go in depth on that healing model of compassion. We really unpack it, but you can still glean the basic steps of what to do and what not to do by looking at that. So I encourage you to take a look.
And that's it for today. We have a lot of great feedback, very helpful, so appreciative, very informative, etc. So I just want you to be encouraged.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for being here, and come back again for our next intensive. Take good care. Bye.